to this beautiful spring day in the Johann Fust Library. As most of you know, thanks to Helene and then to Milton, there were no fall programs here. As I look around at all of you in this beautiful loggia and courtyard, it just amazes me when I think about how this looked just a little over 2 months ago, and that we were able to welcome you all to 4 different programs in our winter months. Yes. On behalf of our foundation board and staff and our Lee County librarians, thank you, all of you, for your support for what started out as a challenging year for us and for many of you, and some of us still is. We are happy you're here with us today to hear Darrell Hartman speak about his book, Battle of Ink and Ice. Darrell is a freelance writer whose work has appeared in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the Paris Review. He writes about travel and culture. This is his first book, and it was the winner of the 2023 National Outdoor Book Award. I am looking forward to hearing about how 2 rival newspapers, the New York Times and the New York Herald, covered 2 different controversial explorers of the Arctic and promoted each one in very different ways. In 1909, these popular explorers captivated the public's attention. Now I think Darrell will captivate us as he tells us about that year and the role of the newspapers in reporting it. And after the event, you may purchase his book right over here. So thank you, and let's welcome Darrell.
Thank you, Cappy. Wonderful to be here. I've been doing book talks for a little while now, but this has got to be the most beautiful venue I've been able to do it in, and to do it outdoors. I want to thank Kevin and Barbara McLaughlin for setting this up originally, planting the seed to get me down here, and Mike Goldberg, Linda Fairstein, thank you for being wonderful hosts, and to the library, of course, for providing a great venue and bringing a real crowd. So here we go. Someone asked earlier if I was bringing either Arctic weather or New York City weather down with me, and I said I sure hope not, because this is perfect. But here we are. So to me, this story, Battle of Ink and Ice, it's really a tale of 2 stories, a story of exploring and a story of the newspapers. And those are somewhat separate stories, but they're also very intertwined, which is kind of the main reason I thought this was an interesting idea to pursue. The papers funded a lot of these expeditions. They told the story of these expeditions, and as we will see, sometimes they took sides in a way that really is an interesting thing to reflect on these days. We talk about the media partisanship, but it's all concerning in some ways. But I found while I was writing this book, which was between 2018 and 2023, it was almost therapeutic to sort of go back into the history of American media and try to go deeper and to understand the way our press works, for better and for worse. So on the one hand, I originally set out to write this book wanting to tell a story of old school explorers, men clad in furs racing across the Arctic ice with their dog sleds, a lost world, if you will, because that's not really something we do anymore. And so that is kind of, those tales of courage are a part of this book. But the story of the media is the one that really resonates, I think, and makes it feel like a contemporary story. And if I weigh those 2 elements, that was the one that kind of drove me more to spend years writing this book and to put it out there, because I thought it gives us a lot to think about. It feels very 21st century. As opposed to 19th century, which is the fur-clad explorers part. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the book. I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't spoil too much. I don't want to give the ending away too much. So that's the plan here. And Bobby from the museum, thank you very much for all you've done, including arranging for these great printouts of the main characters. This is our cast. And I will go through them as they pop up in the story. So September 1st, 1909 is when this phenomenon known as the North Pole controversy begins. September 1st, 1909. A cablegram arrives in the world's telegraph stations from an explorer named Frederick Cook. This is an American explorer, not that well known. And the cablegram says, reached North Pole April 21, 1908. So he's claiming to have reached the North Pole more than a year ago. And then he was stuck in the Arctic and he was only able to get back in 1909. So he sends this cablegram, this cable from the town of Lerwick. Does anyone know where Lerwick is? It's in the Shetland Islands, northern Scotland, which was the nearest cable station. And these are undersea cables, which we are now more aware of because the Russians are cutting them. But they were very much webbing the world at this time. This is the closest thing that they had to email. So he is sending cables under the sea. Greenland, where he's coming from, does not have cable service. So the nearest he can get is the Shetland Islands. And he sends this news to several people, the most important of whom for our stories is a newspaper publisher named James Gordon Bennett Jr., the very evil looking gentleman here. And I'll get into him in a little bit. James Gordon Bennett Jr., for me, was one of the delightful discoveries of this book, a very colorful, eccentric character who owned and published the most important newspaper of the time, the New York Herald. So Frederick Cook sends this to the Herald because the Herald is a famous newspaper with an illustrious past of paying for exploration stories, basically. 2 days later, Frederick Cook, who is on a steamship, arrives in Copenhagen. So he's sent his cable. The news of his great North Pole discovery has slingshotted around the world. It's the stuff of all the world's headlines, especially the New York Herald's headlines, because Frederick Cook has sold the exclusive story to the New York Herald. So here we have the Herald owning Cook's story and investing in it. Very important point. So he is the star of the exploring world. He's the toast of Copenhagen. Copenhagen is full of explorers as well because it's Scandinavian, and I love that sort of thing. The world's press comes to Copenhagen to tell the story of Frederick Cook, the arriving explorer. And at one of these big dinner parties that are thrown for Frederick Cook in Copenhagen, in the middle of the dinner, someone walks in the door and hands Frederick Cook a message in front of all these journalists. And Frederick Cook reads the message and stands up. And it's actually it's a telegram from another polar explorer, another American explorer, Robert Peary. And the telegram reads, "Stars and stripes nailed to the pole." This is a very Robert Peary way of saying, I have reached the North Pole. So a moment of celebration becomes a double moment of celebration, especially if you're American, because getting to the North Pole is something the world's great countries have been trying to do for centuries. And now not one, but two Americans are coming back and saying they got to the North Pole. So it's a joyous moment that quickly turns sour because Robert Peary accuses Frederick Cook of lying. Calls him, in the parlance of the period, he said he's handed the public a gold brick, which is 1900 slang for he's a con man, and made the whole thing up. So to go over our characters, Frederick Cook is here. He sold his story to James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald. This is the redoubtable Robert Peary in his furs with his sled dogs. And Robert Peary has a syndication deal with Adolph Ochs, the gentleman to my left of the New York Times. So the minute that Robert Peary accuses Frederick Cook of lying, we launch into this sort of 3-month newspaper war over who is telling the truth and who is not. And it is as much a battle of Robert Peary versus Frederick Cook as it is a battle of the New York Times versus the New York Herald. And we'll get a little bit into why those papers are different and why it's an interesting sort of conflict between them. And it also demonstrates the degree to which newspapers shape the ways people thought about things, especially obscure things that are hard to understand, such as, did you get to the North Pole or not? So I'm going to get to Adolph Ochs in the incredible story of how he acquired the New York Times and turned around the New York Times and created the dynasty of the New York Times that exists today. Hawkes's daughter married into a family called the Sulzbergers, and the Sulzbergers now still control and run the New York Times. James Gordon Bennett was a hard-drinking playboy who never settled down or had any children, and the Herald disappeared after he died. So we have a tale of two different newspapers. The Herald did merge with the Tribune and become the Herald Tribune, which then did become the International Herald Tribune. Anyone who spent time in Europe in the 20th century probably read the International Herald Tribune. But for all intents and purposes, he did not have a dynasty at all. So these are highly contrasting personalities, Ox and Bennett. So I'm going to talk a little bit about James Gordon Bennett Jr., because he is kind of the forgotten man in this story. He ran the New York Herald, as I said. The New York Herald was founded by his father, James Gordon Bennett Sr., in 1835. Hugely important newspaper for the history of American media, because it really was the first truly independent and, I would say, modern newspaper. We're going back to the 1830s. This was a time when newspapers are really tools of powerful small groups of people who are not interested in getting the truth out there, and they're really only interested in serving their own interests, whether it was a group of investors looking to pump their own stocks, or it was a political machine. Often a political machine sort of owned or ran newspapers. The incredible thing about the Herald was it was completely independent of these influences. James Gordon Bennett Sr. Was voracious in getting the news. He had the first stock report, and what was interesting about it was just news on the stocks without a hidden agenda to that reporting. He had the first society column. He sent boats out into New York Harbor to interrupt the returning steamships to get the news from Europe first before everyone else did. An incredibly successful, enterprising, and also highly controversial figure in the news media. But he turns the Herald into the most profitable and influential newspaper by the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s. By the time we get into the 1860s, his son, James Gordon Bennett Jr., is being sort of groomed to take over the newspaper, and it is not going very well. He is very spoiled. He's a silver spoon child. He likes to party and race fast sailboats and drive fast carriages. He's just a rake hell, basically, with little interest in doing anything serious. So at the time, there's not much hope for the future of the Herald. But an interesting thing happens. In 1867, one drunken night at the Union Club in New York City, he is part of a wager with some other clubmen to participate in the first transatlantic yacht race, leaving from New York City, ending up in, I believe it's the Isle of Cows in England. And craziest of all, they decided to do this in December. 3 different yachts, private yachts. Bennett and 2 friends. The other 2 friends chicken out and send people to go in their stead. Bennett alone gets on the vessel himself. They're almost killed. Frigid temperatures, blustery gales. Somehow they not only make it, but win this race. And I think something interesting happens to him psychologically at this time, because he comes back to New York, and all of a sudden he's looking like a very serious new publisher of the New York Herald. And so he becomes the managing editor a year later in 1868, and he does this really earth-shaking thing, which is to send an intrepid reporter named Henry Stanley into Africa to find a missing explorer named David Livingstone. So that line, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, which many of us may not know why it's famous or what it means, it comes from this moment. And why was it so famous? I just can't understate how captivating this mystery of where did David Livingstone disappear to. And the amazing thing about the Herald was you had the British government, you had the Royal Geographical Society, these sort of big, powerful institutions who should have gone looking for Dr. Livingstone. But instead, it was an American newspaper who sent a reporter after the most famous explorer in the world. And the reporter found him and rescued him. So this was a bombshell story, a huge success for the Herald, and it really launched a trend in the 1870s of sending intrepid reporters around the world in Indiana Jones style to solve mysteries and dig up lost artifacts and rescue people and all that. So at this point, James Gordon Bennett Jr. has proven himself a very worthy heir to the New York Herald, which is now even more sort of head and shoulders ahead of the competition as a result of this great Livingston Stanley coup. Bennett himself is still making a drunken fool of himself around New York City in the finest dining rooms and club rooms of the city, but that's another story. He somehow is managing to run the paper very well. So after this Stanley bombshell, his interests shift to the North Pole. He figures, I've done an amazing thing in Africa. He actually bankrolls another African expedition on this huge new idea, which is that a newspaper doesn't need to just report the news. The newspaper can actually make the news. Its own correspondent does something great. It has complete ownership of the story. This is both exciting and a great business proposition. So he next tries to do this with the North Pole. There's an expedition called the USS Jeannette, if anyone knows it here. This was a collaboration between the US Navy and the Herald. The Navy staffed the vessel, basically, and Bennett paid the bill and had some creative input, for better or worse. This ended poorly. The attempt to get to the North Pole was a terrible disaster. And in fact, there's a whole book about it written by Hampton Sides, who I know talked to recently. Yes, Hampton was here. Hampton blurbed my book too. We're both polar guys. And so if you haven't read In the Kingdom of Ice, it's an incredible book about this ill-fated Jeannette expedition funded by the Herald. So after that, we really have two things happen around this time, the 1870s, early 1880s. This naval attempt to get to the North Pole fails miserably. Another army-funded expedition to get to the North Pole, led by someone named Adolphus Greely, comes to grief. And both these things they spook the government, basically. And there's a lot of gnashing of teeth and tearing of hair over the senseless tragedies that result when people try to get to the North Pole. There's death, there's suffering, there's wasted money, blood and treasure, and all that. And so the government in the US, at least, gets out of exploring almost entirely and seeds the field to this new crop of, I call them privateers, sort of private explorers. Men like Robert Peary will become part of this new crop, and it calls for a different set of skills. Yes, Robert Peary, he's in the Navy. He's a Navy man. He's an engineer, but he is not doing these expeditions under the auspices of the Navy. And this, to me, is what makes it a very modern, pivotal moment in exploring. These are entrepreneurs of exploration. And to be successful entrepreneurs, they need to convince donors to send them on their way, to raise money, and they need to work productively with the press, because the newspapers now become a more important element of these expeditions. They're investing money in an explorer in hopes of recouping it in glory and newspaper sales. So this is kind of the dawn of this very modern partnership that is going to, I would say, explode during the Cook-Peary controversy, when the newspapers are so deeply attached to their explorers that it actually creates a problem. So Robert Peary launches his career in the mid 1880s. He's Pennsylvania born, but he's raised in Brunswick, Maine, which incidentally is where I was born. So he's a Mainer for all intents and purposes. He goes to Bowdoin College, joins the Navy, and pretty soon he's using all his free time to explore Greenland and the polar regions, with the ultimate goal of reaching the North Pole. In the 1890s, he does a couple interesting things. He struggles to get enough Navy leave to fully try to get to the pole. So he ends up bringing things back and trying to start cultivating his donor base, if you will, collecting artifacts. Some might say sort of stealing artifacts or bargaining in a sort of unfair way with the Inuit natives. But he's doing that, including, to me, this is just an incredible little side story. He discovered why the Inuit of northern Greenland had metal. This was a mystery that was troubling scientists for quite a while. And it turned out there was a secret source of metal for these harpoon tips and arrowheads, and that was a giant chunk of meteorite that Robert Peary was able to locate, and not only locate this 34-ton piece of meteorite, but move it onto his ship and bring it back to Fifth Avenue. So they're great photographs. He was an engineer, as I said, so his brain worked in this way. But there are photographs of this 30-ton meteorite being moved on rails up Fifth Avenue and basically delivered at the doorstep of the American Museum of Natural History. So Robert Peary, a very driven man, and this is what he was good at. He was cultivating influential donors with the Museum of Natural History, as he was cultivating influential donors with the National Geographic Society, this sort of scientific, philanthropic establishment of America at this time. And later, during this North Pole controversy, these connections proved to be very important to Robert Peary, but not necessarily serving the cause of truth. He has a 4-year period from 1898 to 1902 where he desperately tries to get closer and closer to the North Pole. Does not really succeed in doing this. He does succeed in losing 8 toes to frostbite. So the last 10 years or so of his career, Robert Peary is trying to get to the North Pole on 2 toes. Very painful process for him. He had sort of the cutting edge surgery of the 1890s, which one does not think was very cutting edge at all. And he would shuffle on his feet for the rest of his life. But being Robert Peary, this did not daunt him. And actually, this might be a bit of legend, but at the moment when he's in this freezing polar hut, having made an overnight journey in super sub-zero temperatures, and his assistant, Matthew Henson, pulls his rabbit skin socks off in this frigid cold, and Robert Peary has complained of a wooden feeling in his legs. This sock is pulled off, and 8 of those toes come off with the sock. Matthew Henson responds in horror, and Robert Peary is said to have said, "It's a small price to pay for the pole." So we have a very driven, competitive man here in Robert Peary. This is the type of personality that he was. So I'm going to take a quick pause and turn here to talk about the newspapers. And also just a note, on one of his early expeditions, Robert Peary brings 3 interesting people. One is the assistant I mentioned, Matthew Henson. We don't have a photograph of him. Unfortunately, the interesting thing about Matthew Henson was that he was a black man doing these Arctic expeditions, and he was said to be the best non-Inuit driver of sled dogs in the world. And his story is an incredible story. There are several books out about it now. Just a wonderful anomaly of the history of this period. You can't imagine there are other black men as part of this polar exploring world. He was the one, and an interesting character. Robert Peary also brought his wife, Josephine Peary. Robert Peary had just a different way of thinking about stuff. So in the 1890s, he had a 2-year expedition. His wife, Josephine, not only came along, but gave birth to a child, Marie Peary, who became known as the Snow Baby. And this was supposedly an Inuit name because they'd never seen a white baby before. And the Inuit, not only in the immediate area, but from miles around, would come to visit the so-called Snow Baby. And Josephine was a very good writer, actually, in her own right, probably a better writer than Robert Peary, in fact. And the funny thing is they came back from this, and Robert Peary is writing these sort of self-aggrandizing stories about his polar adventures for the newspapers and trying to get more publicity. And his wife's articles about domestic life in the Arctic are just blowing his out of the water. She is the cultural phenomenon more than he is at a certain point. The third person he brings along, incidentally, is Frederick Cook. So in 1909, as I've sort of set up, Cook and Peary are bitter enemies and each will want the other dead. But early in their careers, they're actually very fruitful collaborators. And Frederick Cook comes along as the surgeon and botanist on an early Peary expedition, and actually does a huge favor to Robert Peary, who breaks his leg before they've even hit land. And Frederick Cook resets Peary's broken leg and really saves the whole expedition. So these are some of the characters in Robert Peary's early expeditions. Frederick Cook will continue to go to the Arctic and will do some interesting exploring, but his profile is nowhere near as high as Robert Peary's. He's not as famous. He does not have as many friends in high places, and his name is going to come out of the blue, as it were, when he comes back from the North Pole. So just to turn to the left for a quick second, if we're at around 1900 now, Robert Peary is the most famous polar explorer in America. Frederick Cook is experienced but not as well known. And they've both started in a sort of basic way to be working with the newspapers that pay for them to go on these expeditions. When some of us were in school, or when we think about the 1890s and turn of the century period of American media, most of us learn about the yellow journals, right? This is the era of Pulitzer, Joseph Pulitzer, and William Randolph Hearst. These are the penny journals. These are very sort of really the ancestors of the tabloids. It's the popular press. And of course, the popular press was sort of sensational and emotional and exaggerated everything and loved putting divorce scandals and axe murders and things like that on the front page. This is a type of media we're now pretty familiar with, but it was kind of starting around this period. And of course, the yellow journals were famously blamed for stirring up all this jingoistic sort of war spirit and getting America into the Spanish-American War, which there's some truth to that. I think it was overstated, but there's some truth to the power of these popular media to stir the public passion. Often at the time, it was said for the wrong reasons, right? You sell newspapers, you get people all worked up, and it's not actually for the better of civil society at all. What we learn less about, I think, is the other so-called quality press of the period, which was really what was driving a lot of stuff in terms of government policy and the way the intelligentsia thought about things. This was really the influential press of the time. So the Herald was one of the most influential examples of that. The other thing I would add is basically all these influential newspapers, the most influential ones tended to be in New York City. So New York City was sort of driving the way people thought around America. Provincial papers were taking their stories from New York City. A lot of the best foreign correspondence was in New York City. A lot of the best other genres were in New York City, and that was disseminating around the country. So the Herald was a very popular, long-standing New York City paper with a history, as I said, of supporting expeditions, among other things. And the New York Times was like a dead horse. The New York Times in 1896 had a respectable past, a respectable readership, and it was basically bankrupt. It had its glory days. It had had some tough patches. Its founding editor and founding publisher had both died. The successors had made some bad business decisions. And the other thing is it really hadn't evolved with the times very much. Newspapers were getting more pictorial, more exciting, big blasting headlines, and the Times was very conservative and sort of kept these thick blocks of text, never got worked up about anything, always had a sensible, down the middle opinion on every single topic. This was the Times of the 1890s. But the problem with that is that it was going to die. Basically, it was being propped up by a sort of board of Wall Street well-wishers who liked its financial policies. But the minute those people, including J.P. Morgan and August Belmont, decided they were tired of losing money on this paper, it was going to go kaput. So Adolph Ox swoops in out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and somehow manages to acquire this glorious old relic of the New York Times. And just a little bit on Ox, I really do think this is one of the great sort of rag to riches stories, certainly in American media, if not all of American business. He was the son of Bavarian Jewish immigrants to America. His mother was a Confederate supporting Jewish immigrants. His father was politically totally opposite. So young Adolf grew up in a household just full of political tension, and I think developed these sort of diplomatic skills from a very early age. He was also a true bootstrap sort of worker, incredible work ethic, worked long days. His father basically bankrupted the family, so it fell to Adolf Ochs to support the family. He built a small, successful newspaper business and then empire in Tennessee, of all places, which is where his family lived, and enjoyed some, notoriety and respectability in Tennessee. But the idea that he would go up to New York City and join the people bidding for the New York Times and end up owning the Times is really an incredible story. I'll leave it at that. I tell the story in the book. Suffice to say, he turns around the Times' fortunes at a time when every newspaper, think of it as sort of the age of social media. Every newspaper is under pressure from these yellow journals, from these sensational newspapers to go sensational, to put bigger, splashier pictures on the front page, to cover these divorces on the front page, to get people riled up, to get people angry. And this is what is working commercially. Adolf Ochs is the one big newspaper publisher in New York to resist that trend. And he, if anything, makes the Times more boring. He leans into the boringness of the Times because he says people need reliable news they can trust. Not everybody, but educated people and more people than we realize. And so he really makes the Times, he almost scraps its editorial page entirely. He really makes it just about news, finance news, political news, news you can use. So it's a conservative paper. The other interesting thing he does, he staffs it with a real cast of modern characters. And the one I will mention is sort of forgotten figure named Carl Van Anda. And this is a savant-like figure who Ochs hires to run the newsroom. Carl Van Anda worked long hours and yet also had time to study physics on the side. He actually has this giant forehead. If you see pictures of him, just contains this giant brain. But to me, he was the embodiment of this new type of scientific thinking that's coming into the New York Times newsroom. Journalism throughout the 1800s is sort of thought of as a rascal's game. It's full of colorful, hard-smoking characters. None of them went to college, really. They're not going to be career journalists. They're not professionals. And this turn of the century moment, pioneered by the New York Times, is really about turning the newsroom into a professional, rational, cool-headed environment that it never really was before. And Carl Van Anda, to me, is the sort of embodiment of this new type of journalist. And it's the type of place that Ochs creates for him. And the idea of objectivity in journalism, objectivity in news reporting, does not come until after World War I. But the seeds for that type of rational scientific thinking when it comes to reporting the news are being planted at this moment. Unfortunately, the Times is not going to be completely true to its value system during the North Pole controversy. It's only human. So what's happening as the Times does this and growing and becoming more successful is it is clearly emerging as a rival to the New York Herald. Not only is it gaining readership, it's poaching a lot of this sort of educated cosmopolitan readership that the Herald has, and it's getting interested in topics that the old New York Times is not really that interested in. These sort of stodgy financial class New York Times of the 1880s and 1890s is not really. They actually thought the North Pole hunt, for example, was a big waste of time. They didn't really have a big adventurous spirit. It was a very practical-minded newspaper. But the Times under Ochs is going to kind of get interested in the North Pole. It's going to get interested in these exciting new technologies of aviation, science, technology, things like this, and foreign reporting. And these are all areas that the Herald has prided itself on as its sort of specialty. And the Herald is slipping. James Gordon Bennett Jr. is getting older. He's blowing even more money than usual on his fancy yachts and his expensive houses in France. One thing I forgot to mention is James Gordon Bennett is running the most profitable newspaper in America from France. since 1877. So he's the original absentee boss, running the company basically by cable. And it wasn't necessarily his choice to do that. He was more or less banished from New York society in 1877 because of a drunken act he performed in a drawing room full of respectable ladies. I'm not going to say what it was. You'll have to read the book. But he's not welcome in polite society, and he always sort of didn't give too much of a concern to that anyway. But really, after this one thing he does, it's too much, and he really does not live in New York ever again. He's mostly in Paris, a nice Riviera town called Beaulieu, and on a succession of very expensive yachts. So this is the sort of king-like figure of Bennett. But as he gets older and less focused, and more of his journalists sort of are fed up with working with him because he's a terrible boss, the Herald starts to slip. It's losing ground. It's not able to bring in the same amount of talent it had before. Times are changing. The Herald is not fully adapting with the times. And the Herald also has one incident that puts it even further under, which I'm not sure. I don't know if I should go into. I'll go into some detail on it. The Herald, for a long time, had this famous section of the paper called the Personals. This is a classified section of the newspaper, and it would serve a number of purposes. It's just interesting to think about what newspapers used to do. If someone in your family had run away from home, eloped, or whatever, and you were desperate to get that person back, one thing you might do is put a notice in a very popular newspaper like the Herald. So and so, please come home, all will be forgiven. Contact us. And you'd leave a coded number at the Herald office. And if someone read that and contacted the Herald would put you in touch. So it served these, you could lose something on a trolley car in New York City. And if the person who found it was a good Samaritan, they would put a notice in the Herald. So these personal pages had a nice civic purpose. Unfortunately, human beings being what we are, many of these were solicitations for paid sex also. So someone would advertise, I'm trying to remember some of the expressions, cozy Parisian suites was code word for a brothel, and you had hammams, these other sort of little code words known throughout the press industry to be what they were, but politely ignored, despite the fact that this was illegal. This was basically obscenity in the mails, federal crime. And ultimately, James Gordon Bennett Jr. is protected because the newspapermen look out for each other, but he gets into a terrible feud with William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst says, screw this gentleman's agreement. I'm going after the Herald personals. And he sends a bunch of reporters to follow up on these personal ads for hammams and cozy Parisian suites. And his reporters come back with stories of what happens in these hammams and Parisian suites. And a huge fine is applied to the Herald, and its reputation takes a nosedive. The Herald, never known for being the most upstanding paper, but this really hurts it even more. So this is just one of several, I suppose, old-timey business disasters that hits the Herald. So by the time, I'm just mindful of the time here, by the time of this North Pole controversy, the playing field has really been almost leveled between the Herald, which used to be up here, and the Times, which is down here. 10 years or so after Ox acquires the Time, they're almost on equal footing. And the difference in hindsight is that the Times is really the paper of the future, and the Herald is a paper of the past, which is a bit of a shame, because when I was researching this, going back and reading old copies of the Herald was just a real pleasure, sort of a mix between Vanity Fair and the New York Post, sort of high-low with way too much coverage of European royals and what they were wearing, and like far more pages than you thought on the latest yacht regatta, because this is what Bennett personally was interested in, but he also sort of identified this almost populist interest in what fancy people were doing. He had a smart sort of idea about the news, but he was kind of a dinosaur. And one area in which he kind of missed the boat had to do with professional standards. I talked about the personals. the personal scandal is happening at a time when the newspaper industry really was having a sort of reckoning about what it was in society. And the thought was basically, we had this kind of Wild West period of the newspapers, and now we are entering the 20th century, and it needs to be a little bit more professional. We need to make sure all our advertising is appropriate. We need to do some basic fact checking, all these sort of things that became hallmarks of good metropolitan journalism in the 20th century start to become standardized. And a paper like the Herald, which is a very good newspaper in some ways, but it has some eccentric quirks about it, is going to be left out by this much more rational sort of corporate approach to the news, and I guess professionalized. And if I stand back for a second and sort of reflect on where we are now in the media, I think we are regressing. I think there is not as much of a focus on getting the story right, on taking the time, and I think the internet has really decimated the business model for a lot of this sort of civically important journalism. And as a result, you have a lot of desperate sort of moves. And the trade of being a journalist is less professional as a result. So, interesting just to compare those two moments. So, just to set up how these deals got made between Peary and Cook, I mentioned Cook sent that cable from Scotland. Robert Peary very intelligently sets up his deal in advance. It's now 1908, and Robert Peary has sold the rights to some of his previous expeditions to the Herald. And his first stop then, when he's in New York raising money, is to go to the New York Herald. And when he goes to the Herald, does anybody guess where the Herald was based? Herald Square, yes. How about the Times? Times Square, yes. So it's about 8 blocks away from me. So he starts at the Herald. He is told that the editor he used to know at the Herald, who bought his story before, I'm sorry, Mr. Peary, that editor is no longer with us at the Herald. Peary says, well, where is he? He's joined the Times. Well, in that case, what about Mr. Lincoln, the sub-editor who negotiated my contract the last time I was here at the Herald? Can I speak to him? I'm sorry, Mr. Peary. Mr. Lincoln has joined the Times. And so Robert Peary finally gets a meeting with this sort of new, sort of a flunky type of editor, because Bennett has just fired all his good people. And this Herald editor declines to get the Herald invested in Peary's story. We're not going to sort of back you this time. We'll just get the normal story from the wire services or whatever. So Robert Peary goes up Broadway to the Times, where he's warmly greeted by these former Herald editors. He's warmly greeted by Carl Van Anda, the guy with the giant brain that I mentioned. And he's warmly greeted by Ox as well, Adolph Ox. And they are very keen to support Robert Peary. They put some money into his expedition. They cut this business deal. So when Robert Peary comes back in 1909 saying, I've reached the pole, and then he also says Frederick Cook is telling a great big lie, he's now got the New York Times in quite a tizzy. What do we do here? We thought we lost this race to the North Pole because Frederick Cook came back first, and now the Herald sort of beat us. Robert Peary sort of flips that scenario on its head. The Times is trying to do the right thing, and it's been a little suspicious of Frederick Cook's story from the beginning. Does it have self-interested reasons to doubt that story? Yes, but it also has a very intelligent Carl Van Anda and other very intelligent skeptical journalists looking at what Frederick Cook is saying about his North Pole journey. And they're not so sure. And the problem is the Times back then, and some would say also now, is very close to received opinion. It really likes a sort of establishment opinion on stuff. And the establishment is pretty supportive of Cook's claim. So one of the first things the New York Times does is go to the National Geographic Society and says, who is this guy Cook? Is he respectable? Do we think it's credible that he went to the North Pole? And the National Geographic Society says, yes, it seems plausible. So the Times mostly goes with that story. Robert Peary comes back, and all these partisan lines start being drawn because the National Geographic Society, well, actually, now that they're quite close to Peary, and now that Peary's saying Cook didn't make it, maybe we're not so sure Cook made it after all. And these battle lines are really being drawn, and the Times is trying to be objective and skeptical and hard-headed. But what you'll see is it's actually being much more skeptical of Frederick Cook than it is when it comes to its own guy, Robert Peary. And Peary's credentials and scientific sort of friends and alliances with institutions like the National Geographic Society get him a lot of leverage and leeway. And it's also just sort of a throwback to a time when explorers were kind of considered people of great honor and respectability, and they were not the sort of people who would ever lie about anything, because this is just not what a noble person does. And this controversy would really change that attitude significantly. So to me, it's kind of this interesting postmodern moment in exploring, where the what happened, what didn't happen, will we ever know? Maybe we can't ever know the full truth, sort of crosses people's minds for the first time. So in my experience, I don't think there was ever an exploring story like this up to this point. After this, there actually were a couple other dodgy moments where either one person was lying or both were lying. But I think this amount of confusion had never spilled out of the exploring world before. And in some ways, the media clarified this confusion for people, and in some ways, it made it worse. And the last thing, just to clear up, why couldn't we just figure out who went to the North Pole? So, unlike the South Pole, the North Pole, I'm probably explaining this mostly to people who already know this, but it is a theoretical point on floating sea ice. If you plant a flag there, the flag will float away. Someone tries to follow your footsteps across the ice, they will follow it in this giant sort of circle that's being pushed by currents and wind and everything. And so it's very hard to follow anyone's footsteps when you're in the Arctic Ocean. And it's actually very hard for an explorer to know if he has been to the North Pole in 1909 using the instruments of that period. It's a very complicated calculation using a sextant, compass, a chronometer, and a whole suite of complicated tools. So one reason this controversy did not happen between Scott and Amundsen or anyone like Shackleton, these sort of South Pole Antarctic heroes, they were probably more upstanding men, I would say that. They had stronger character, but it was a much easier job to get there, perhaps, but certainly to prove you had been there. And so you have that on top of that fact. Robert Peary and Frederick Cook were both asked to provide evidence of where they had been. Show us your travel logs, all your astronomical readings. We will have the scientists, if not also the newspapers, look at this information. Both of these men declined to present their proofs. Eventually, some of these proofs were shown behind closed doors. The results of those closed door sessions were made public, but we didn't really know what happened. Robert Peary was called before Congress several years later and showed his notebook, which had some strange missing pages in them. And this was entered into the congressional record because he was interrogated pretty heavily by some congressmen, all Democrats. So it's interesting. I didn't even mention this. Frederick Cook, Democrat, Robert Peary, Republican. I didn't mention that. So another layer of sort of just timeless partisanship going on here. I won't give away any more details. I will say the man who lived longer enjoyed a certain advantage up to a certain point. Both these explorers enjoyed several generations of supporters fighting their case. And most remarkable of all, perhaps, the New York Times issued a correction in 1988. So this is 80 years after, saying that it probably got the story wrong. So that's okay. Buried nice and deep in the paper, yes. So very Timesian things to do. I I enjoyed learning so much about the New York Times. It really did view itself under Ox. It came to view itself as the newspaper of record, right, which is an expression that not everyone agrees with, but it took seriously this idea that its reporting would last forever. And it created Ox created a whole new indexing system that made it easier for historians to look back on old issues of the Times, much easier than it was to look back on old issues of any other paper. And the reason was that he had this idea of longevity and a sort of dutiful reporting of the truth. The critique at the time was it was the elites' version of the truth, but it was dutiful, and it was there to be consulted. And so this whole idea of a paper of record, whether you agree that the Times is the paper of record or not, the whole idea that any American newspaper would try to be a paper of record was quite groundbreaking at the time. And as a researcher, and I know there's some other historical researchers in here, the Times's archive is an incredible tool and a joy to go through. It's very usable, it's very comprehensive, and history really does live in those pages. So this is kind of the moment it started, and it started around the time this very strange polar controversy. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk and you'll read the book.
Q&A?
And we are doing a Q&A. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say I enjoyed your book very much. I'm curious, in 1909, did they realize that there was a difference between the North Pole and the magnetic North Pole?
They did, yes. The magnetic North Pole is just not really a big deal. I don't fully understand why. I think there was this great symbolic value to the North Pole. And even in the 1870s, when Bennett sent that Jeannette expedition off, the reason he chose the North Pole is that really there were three great discoveries left on terrestrial Earth: the South Pole, the origin of the Nile, source of the Nile, and the North Pole. I think it's the physical extremity. They hadn't turned mountains into this big thing yet, which would happen, of course, in the 20th century. But the extremity, the geographical extremity of these places gave them a huge symbolic value. And the magnetic North Pole did not have that. For some reason, it's moving around. It's not the extreme of the planet. It's this sort of random spot that geologists are interested in, but not many other people are actually interested in it. The other thing that was a huge kind of grail, of course, was the Northwest Passage. And the interesting thing about the Northwest Passage, in contrast to the North Pole, there was a very clear commercial, practical advantage to the Northwest Passage, which was a shipping lane that would revolutionize international commerce. The North Pole, by the time we get into this Peary Cook phase, people basically know there's nothing to be found at the North Pole. It's not useful. It's purely symbolic. So whoever gets there first gets the trophy.
When did competition from news radio start entering the scene? Did that have an effect on newspapers? I know it was later than this.
Right. News radio, gosh, my expertise ends at around 1909, but we're 20s and 30s, right? You know, you had Marconi Wireless was actually starting to be adopted by newspapers around 1906. The Times installed a Marconi tower in 1907, so it could get news from sea before they came to shore. Radio, you know, so evolved from that, but it would be a couple decades. And you know, it's an interesting question. When did the newspapers actually start to believe they were competing with radio, which is a slightly different question. But certainly into the 20s, the newspapers were still the main first point. I think radio is more popular. People would rather listen than read, right?
Yeah.
A question for you is, what was your inspiration in picking up this project? You're a journalist, and all of a sudden you're taking on a book.
Yeah.
And you know, what was the first question, I guess, that you were going after to answer, and maybe how did that change as you got into this project?
Right. That last one's the toughest. So, yes, I'd been a journalist in New York City for more than a decade when I took this on. I was started by being interested in old explorers. I wanted a sort of old school tale of survival and courage and all this stuff. And the reason I chose this one was entirely from the media angle. You know, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was modern. And I actually felt a stronger personal connection to it as someone who'd been dashing around New York City trying to get my sphere was a little different, but trying to get that story. And I was actually first drawn to the journalist point of view, which I ended up dumping for a good part of the book. But I love these old journalist memoirs of the journalist life, of dashing off. There's a moment in the book where Robert Peary is they know Peary is coming back through Eastern Canada, and one of the journalists in the New York Times is coming off a job, and his boss tells him to get on the next train to Nova Scotia, and he doesn't even have time to go home and change. He throws on his summer hat, and he gets a wad of $100 bills from his boss and dashes on the train. And that sort of energy I loved. And so I don't think there are too many exploring stories where so much of the story is that stuff, because it's a series. At least the 1909 portion of the book is a series of new discoveries being made day after day by the reporters, and the story just changing a little bit week by week. So I like that from several perspectives. I like that because I was a journalist, and I also just like that as a sort of storytelling technique. Part of the book stretches many years, and then there's another part of the book that's almost a week by week retelling with more suspense and sort of detail. So all those things drew me to it. In terms of what I discovered, or the sort of biggest surprise was, I think that's tough to say. I think I just have to give a general answer, which is that people don't really change. These influence campaigns and these competitions and business really driving a lot of in the moment decisions. I think that's the way we still live. I think we think of history when we read it as something more sort of completed and concrete. But if you go into someone's letters, for example, and you see they're just making day by day decisions on stuff, and then we look back on it as the sort of coherent thing, but it's not coherent at the time at all. And this is one of the most incoherent media moments of the decade. Story is changing so quickly, and no one knows the truth. So that was very enlightening, and it made me feel, it's helped me reflect on reading the news today is also very discombobulating. I don't blame the media entirely for that, but it was somehow comforting to see that our ancestors had also been discombobulated by the news. It wasn't more sedate necessarily back then. It wasn't classier back then. It was kind of similar to us today. So,
Is there another question?
Yeah, I was wondering how you researched this book. Obviously, you could read the news clips, and maybe people had letters and diaries like you lived to. Were there any grandchildren or great grandchildren, live sources you could talk to for information?
That's a good question. Yes, but I don't trust them. So there are, as I said, generations of supporters kept this thing going, and I didn't talk to any of them. There are living people who have studied the heck out of this. One in particular I spoke with a lot. His name is Robert Bryce. He wrote something like a 1,200-page book on this controversy, just this controversy. He left nothing out. So he's and a couple other people who have whose opinion I really trusted. I think they've looked at it from all sides. In terms of the other sources, yeah, and academics actually, so the dean of the Columbia School of Journalism happens to have a subspecialty in the history of fake news, which she was really helpful. And so there's a portion of this book which is about fake news, the origin of that term. Pulitzer was using that term as early as 1910. So she looked at it and was a really useful source. A history book like this, you're spending a lot of time with a screen and pages. So I was actually craving human contact. So some of these people I was happy to spend time with. The newspapers are a delight. I think I was relying pretty heavily on the newspapers because I'm telling the story of the story, books, newspapers. The richest archive is the New York Times archive, specifically Ox's correspondence and other stuff. all grouped together at the New York Public Library in Midtown. And the nice thing about that archive is you really feel as though you can get to know Ox, especially when he was in New York City in 1896. I think one thing you want, it's great when someone's doing something important and they're away from their loved ones because they are writing letters about what's going on to their loved ones. And that's what he was doing. He's writing to his wife, Effie, back down in Tennessee, almost day by day updates on this desperate attempt to buy the Times from this tough group of Wall Street guys and how it was going. So as a historian, it's a delight to have that available to use when you reconstruct it, not just the information, but the emotions of it, because he is confiding in his wife. And these sort of Gilded Age businessmen aren't big on emotions. You don't find it in business history. You find it in the letters, if you're lucky, to the wife or someone else, you know? So Ox really left a gift with that. And of course, he was legacy minded. So that is a great thing for historians. He left it behind. He left it to the New York Public Library. Bennett, again, the polar opposite. Bennett has no papers. He probably burned it all. You know, you come up with little sort of notes of his in different weird archives. Early on, again, this was my first book, so I was just ravenous to do research. I said, I'll go everywhere. I'll take 10 years if I need to. That wore off. But in the early stages, I was looking at some random archives of old Herald editors. Like one of the Herald editors ended up being the Librarian of Congress and a pretty distinguished figure. So his records have a couple handwritten notes by Bennett. And so because those are so rare, they had this kind of glow about them. Here's this guy, Bennett, I've heard about so much through second degree sources. And here he is with he was famous for his blue pencils. And here's some of Bennett's florid, sort of nicely trained handwriting and blue pencil saying something kind of irrelevant, but it's still him, you know? So that's the kind of magical stuff. Whether it ends up being useful or not, those archive, especially for a first time author being in the archives, is really great.
Now, we have time for one more question, and we have one right over here.
And I'm not going anywhere after either, so I'll take questions one-on-one too, so that's fine.
I'm curious what your next project is.
That's a good question. I'm working on a co-authored book with someone right now, but I would love to do another book. If anyone has a blockbuster idea with special access to private archives, I'm available after. But I've looked at another Gilded Age story with an Astor family connection. I've looked at something about 60s and 70s tennis, which I think is a great period. Big tennis guy. So these balls are being juggled in the air, but it's tough to sell a book these days. So you really need to bring special sauce when you pitch something like this. You need special access, someone who hasn't spoken before, something that hasn't been seen before. So I'm still looking around is the answer.